Thank you, Professor Alterman. I think, as always, it was certainly provocative, and I can see there are already questions, you know, on this coming on the scroll on the side scroll, and but before coming to the questions, I thought maybe I can also ask a couple of questions, and then.
Proposal.
So one of the things which I was actually looking for, and I think towards the end you mentioned it in but only in passing, about how Turkey, has become very ambitious, and the kind of role Turkey is trying to play or have for itself in the region. It's trying to kind of play both ways in some certain ways. And the other thing was about, I mean, you were talking about the US-led alliance perhaps can play a more constructive role, but do you foresee any, China-Russia-led alliance with, for example, Iran or Turkey, or sometimes, even others, for example, Qatar, playing a counter kind of a role against the US-led alliance?
Thank you. Two really interesting questions. So I have to say, on the Turkey piece, I am constantly wondering how much of what Turkey does is Turkey and how much is President Erdogan. He's been president for so long, and I think has had such an ambitious agenda. It's hard for me to differentiate that, but you're absolutely right to highlight that Turkey's in a very different place than it's been. I think it's a real challenge for the United States, which in many ways grew reliant on the old model of Turkey, which is this sort of, in many ways, a cornerstone of NATO. You had a secularist military government that the US saw eye to eye with. Turkey was internally focused. You had an increasingly robust economy. I mean, Turkey was sort of a happy story. Turkey's been a much less happy story, partly because of the way they've purged the military ranks quite aggressively and gotten rid of many people who have been US partners. They've tried to be opportunistic as they extend into the Middle East. I mean, I remember, it's still within my memory that Turkey's regional policy was zero problems with the neighbors. Yeah. And now their policy seems to be zero neighbors with no problems. I mean, they have problems everywhere, right? And they have problems internally. And President Erdogan had been leading a sort of reconciliation with Turkish Kurds, and that all seems to be out the window. Turkey is very aggressively, seems to be making a bid for dominance in the Mediterranean, which, and I think, intends to inhibit gas development in the Eastern Mediterranean, setting up a confrontation with Israel and with others, which I think is going to grow more tense. Yeah, I don't know how much of Turkey's impulse toward neo-Ottomanism and regional expansion, again, it is a personal thing, and how much of it is a strategic thing. But it seems to me that managing Turkey's growing ambitions, Turkey managing its own ambitions amidst a worsening economy, can be a set of challenges. And I don't know how they unfold. I think it's from an American perspective. One of the interesting things is, friends in the Obama White House told me that President Obama spoke to Erdogan more than he spoke to any other world leader. There really was this effort to bring Erdogan around. President Trump speaks a lot to President Erdogan. and tries to bring him around. There is this constant effort to court Turkey, and yet you see Turkey buying the Russian anti-aircraft system and really creating a huge set of problems in the U.S. relationship. I think Turkey is just going to be a difficult one for some time to come. And I don't think there's an obvious destination. I don't know I don't know what Turkey is trying to become. I see the directions in which Turkey is trying to go, but I don't know what their desired end state is. And it's hard to negotiate over a future when you're not really sure what the desired end state is of a negotiating partner. So I'm if you want to talk more about Turkey, I'd be interested in your take on Turkey, because because it's a real issue, and I think it's not appreciated, and Turkey ends up, because it's sort of partly Europe and partly Middle East. I think it gets a little bit of short shrift in each, but it certainly matters for Eastern Mediterranean. We did a report at CSIS about 18 months ago on reestablishing U.S. anchor in the Eastern Mediterranean. I think it's a really important and significant issue. Your question about either a China-led alliance or a Russian-led alliance, these are countries that don't do alliances. They just don't. I mean, China is a country without allies. They don't believe in alliances. Russia's idea of alliances, back in the Soviet days, had the East Bloc. But Russia doesn't do alliances either. So I think both countries are better at being spoilers than builders. It gives you some opportunity to spoil. But on the positive and constructive end, it seems to me that they're not very effective. As I say, we just did so we've done a couple of podcast series. We did one on China in the Middle East and one on Russia in the Middle East. I grew to really like these podcasts because it's a scripted series and you can talk to experts and they tell you about stuff they've actually seen in a way that I think makes it very engaging and real for audiences, especially for students. One of the interesting things when I talk with Russians is Russians are all about the limits of Russian power. They don't feel like they're a superpower. They're a global power, but they're not a superpower. They can't do nearly the things the US can do. And then Russia looks for opportunities. It looks for low-cost ways to tactically advance Russian interests. But there's not really a Russian strategy. The Russian strategy is survival. I think China looks to be in bilateral relationships where China is the dominant power. And China is the dominant power in every single bilateral relationship except with the United States. It's the number one trading partner of all these countries in the world, but they're not the number one trading partner of China. And that gives China a huge advantage. Just to give you an example from the Middle East, about 30% of Iran's trade is with China. Less than 1% of China's trade is with Iran. Who's the powerful party in that negotiation? We know who the powerful party is. And so the Iranians can say whatever they want. When push comes to shove, they need the Chinese more than the Chinese need them. And the Chinese know it every single day. And the Chinese will play them and use them. And when push comes to shove, Iran is tactical for China and the United States is strategic for China. And the Chinese-Iranian relationship is completely subservient to the US-Chinese relationship. And if the Iranians forget that for a second, they're going to feel a whole world of hurt. And I think the Chinese say, yeah, that's the way the world works. And the Iranians say, okay, well, given that, what do we do? But there's no Chinese-led alliance. As I say, there may be a Chinese effort to frustrate things. But I don't think China believes in allying with other governments in concerted action. It's just not the way they want to work.
Thanks. I think you very rightly, actually, Professor pointed out that it's more about Erdogan than Turkey, and I completely agree with your point on that. But one is certainly looking at Turkey as a very kind of one can say disruptive regional actor, very aggressive, and certainly it's a matter of discussion and further conversation as to how that will affect the regional dynamics. I have a few questions here. May I now request my friend Dr. Alvait Singh to ask his question?
Good morning, Professor. It's always a pleasure to listen to you, sir. And when you speak, I couldn't stop myself from asking a question regarding China, sir. I have been following your work on China and the Middle East for quite some time. So just a month back, you wrote an article on Defense One, stumbling in and stumbling out, where you also talked about Russia and China, as a kind of potential contenders to be in the Middle East post the American age. But at the same time, you interestingly made a remark on this Chinese commercial espionage. So I wanted to have an opinion from you. What do you mean by that, like the Chinese commercial espionage? By giving more China seems to give more importance on investments and, as per your article, less on military. And you talk about the Chinese espionage. How is that going to, if it happens, impact on its relations with the Middle East countries?
So the reporting I've seen, none of which is governmental, none of which is classified. The reporting that's been out there talks about how the Chinese government seeks trade secrets of its partners, of companies around the world. There were reports that the Chinese were trying to tap into institutions doing studies on COVID-19. That when the government is everything, and the government and business are one, that the government considers it a legitimate use of state power to get intelligence on commercial activities. Again, you have this. I mean, I'm not a real China expert, but what we consistently see is that the party and the state security institutions have a role in business and in government, and the lines keep crossing. And the business is partly to further state power. And there's an intimate connection. And state security institutions are used to advance state power, sometimes through economic means and through advancing the opportunities for state-owned industries and everything else in that creates an environment where it can be hard to compete with Chinese businesses because they've taken your trade secrets, because they understand your industry better than you understand your industry, because they've been spying on everybody in your industry. And I think that's not the way most states work, but it's my understanding of the way the Chinese state works.
Thank you, Professor. May I now request Mr. Pratmesh, who wanted to ask a question regarding Russia and the President Trump's election and re-election.
Thank you, sir, for this. My question is that it is proven by the Mueller report that Russia and Trump colluded to win in 2016. So, because of President Trump's closeness to Vladimir Putin, has there been any evidence that the U.S. foreign policy in the Middle East has become compromised, as because Putin helped him win in 2016? So, because of their collusion, has Mr. Trump compromised US interest in the Middle East? Thank you.
Thank you. It's a little hard to hear, but I see your question in the chat, so I think I got the basic gist. There are places where you could argue the U.S. has moved to advance Russian interests. You could argue that what the U.S. has done in Syria has advanced Russian interests, partly by giving the Russians a freer hand to operate in Syria. You could argue that what the U.S. has done in Libya has advanced Russian interests. But it's hard to draw a direct line, and it's hard to say that that's the reason why. I would argue the largest way in which the U.S. has helped advance Russian interests is the broader way in which U.S. partners and allies look and say, where's the United States? And taken the U.S. and made it from a bedrock of partnership and security to a question mark. And I hear this especially when I'm in East Asia and when I speak to Japanese and South Koreans and others who feel they've bet everything. I mean, the U.S. expression is you bet the farm. They bet the farm on the United States. The joke I make is they adopted baseball, for God's sake, right? I mean, that's the extent of the commitment to the U.S. model after World War II. And the U.S. sanctioned Japanese steel as a security threat. It started haggling with the South Koreans in a really transactional way about who pays what for the U.S. troop presence in South Korea. And I would argue that the big question mark about the U.S. in the world, the big question mark about the durability of NATO, that is the most important way in which Russian interests have been advanced, because countries feel they need to hedge. And countries that had been willing to bet everything on the United States now feel they need to hedge, and part of that hedge will be to Russia's benefit.
We have Professor Joseph Kishishian, who has joined us today from Lebanon.
Speaking of legends in Middle Eastern studies, by the way, what an honor.
May I request Professor Kishishian to react?
Thank you, Muddassir, and it's wonderful to listen and join in this conversation. Jon always is a very exciting and provocative speaker, and I always enjoy listening to him. Speaking as an American, of course, I've always been flabbergasted by the fact that we have failed always to make the decision as to whether or not we are really the indispensable country on earth or not. We have to come to terms with that. We either are indispensable or we are not, because either way, it carries a lot of responsibilities to go with it. And in my way of thinking, we have not, and we still will not accept to play second fiddle, whether it is to China, to Russia, or India, or anyone else for that matter. We are going to fight for this, whether people in Iowa or Wisconsin realize it or not. And frankly, I've never really believed that anyone in Washington gives a damn about people in Iowa, but that's a different matter. Now, in the Middle East itself, we confront a love-hate relationship. People in the Arab world and in Israel, of course, people in the Middle East really have a love-hate relationship with us. And I'm interested really in this, in your view, Jon, on this point. They admire our message, they despise our methods. And somehow we have always failed to sell ourselves in the way that we perhaps ought to do a better job in doing. So my question to you really is this: we can continue to be pessimistic, or we can also take the view that we can be also optimistic. The Arab Spring has changed a lot of things, some for the bad, but also some for the good. And the Arab world faces lots of challenges, but there is also a lot of optimism. The question really is for us, what are we going to do about the optimistic part of the changes that are coming? Are we going to just be spectators, or are we going to lend a hand where it matters?
Thank you for that. As I said, I've been such a fan of your work for so long, and you've done so many things that nobody else has done. And so it's a great honor to have you on the call. I think I disagree with you that nobody in Washington cares what people in Wisconsin think. I think the Obama administration policy towards Syria was driven by this perception that 10% of the American public thought we should be militarily involved in Syria, and we're not going to get militarily involved in Syria because that has 10% support. So I think there are certainly ways in which people in government have contempt for the rest of the country. I think, and Bill Burns has written a lot about this. My old boss, Bill Burns, has written about a need to align foreign policy more with the American public. I think if the polls are correct and we're looking at a Biden presidency, I think one of the consequences of that is going to be a desire to engage with some of the people who thought that the Trump approach to the world of advancing American interests has to be incorporated into American foreign policy more clearly. Not that they adopt an America first, but you have to make a case, and you have to make sure this isn't just an elite game that leaves a lot of the country reeling. So I think there's I see a lot of evidence that the people do care, and B, I think we're entering a period where there's going to be more interest in engaging with the rest of the country. I think that's good. I think that's one of the advantages of American democracy isn't always that we do the right stuff, but I think there are a lot of incentives to correct the bigger errors. And I think one of the big errors that arguably the Trump period has highlighted is there are too many people who feel totally disconnected from what the US government does. And I think a democratic government that seeks to maintain power will need to connect with people in a more effective way. I really deeply agree with your idea that the U.S. hasn't understood how to sell itself. I think that, again, the Bush administration's policy was, it felt it had to inspire people. And when I talked to people in the Middle East, everybody had aspirations. They just thought the U.S. was either irrelevant or opposed to them. And so it does seem to me that there's a need to reinvent how the government engages, what the government's trying to do, how it outlines what it's trying to do. I think part of that is engaging more leading partners. I think one of the things you talked about, the indispensable nation, one of the things the U.S. can do better than anybody else is organize other governments. The U.S. ability to deploy hundreds or thousands of people in a single task is unparalleled. I don't mean to offend my Indian colleagues, but the foreign ministry in India has staffing similar to the White House. I think there are about 5 people who work on the Middle East in the foreign ministry. At the end of the Obama administration, there were 30 people in the White House in the Middle East shop, roughly. The US ability to align large bureaucracies and then line up other countries and negotiate shared principles and all those things is unparalleled in the world. And I think that bringing some of that capability to the issue of where's the region going? Where does the region need to go? How do you work with governments? How do you create the right incentives? How do you create the right kinds of reassurances and partnerships to do that? I think is really important. I totally agree with you that the region has opportunities. I think the region has challenges. I think it is a mistake to just throw up our hands and say, hopeless, let them work it out for themselves, because I think that will absolutely come back to bite us. There are a lot of challenges in the region that a larger military presence will not solve. And there are a lot of places in the region where what the governments want and what the governments need are two very different things. I don't know how this is going to play. I mean, frankly, I don't know how this is going to play out. I think there is, I don't know how the election is going to come out. I think what we've seen in the Trump administration is a deinstitutionalization of government, a diminution of government capacity, intentionally driven from the top because the president doesn't trust the bureaucracy and doesn't want to have this sort of whole of government approach. I think in the Biden administration, partly because foreign policy hasn't been a big issue, but partly also because of a desire to unify the party, you may have yet unreconciled pushes between a progressive impulse and a sort of traditionalist impulse working itself out in policy. How that affects policy in the Middle East, I don't know. I think there's certainly a desire. Vice President Biden has talked about a need to end blank checks to Saudi Arabia. What does that actually look like? What's the relationship with countries like the UAE going to be like? Who would be the principal partners the US would want to engage with in the Middle East? I think all that is going to be worked out, I think realistically worked out by people of different views. But I think, we fundamentally agree that there is a need to reinvent how the US approaches the region. There is a need for the US to play both an active and constructive role. And there are tremendous upside opportunities that we would be making a mistake to ignore. Is that helpful?
Thanks, Professor. There was, I think, a question which Divya Malhotra wanted to ask about post-Trump, America and US policies. But I think you have partly, answered that question. So maybe I can invite Ms. Nina Salama, who has joined us from Israel, to ask us question, and maybe you can club both of them together if you add something. Nina.
Thank you, Muddassir. Yes, so I would like to ask whether the Middle East will be dominated by a certain country or superpower or by competing coalitions. Thank you.
So what will be dominated? The Middle East?
Sorry? Whether the Middle East, yes, will be dominated by a certain country or superpower or by competing coalitions. Thank you.
Again, I don't think the U.S. has tried to dominate the Middle East, but the U.S. has tried to orchestrate the Middle East. I think one of the characteristics of the U.S. approach to the international world is this rules-based international order, which isn't about maximizing U.S. power. It's about maximizing the environment under which the U.S. operates. And granted, it's an environment that serves U.S. interests, but I think it serves a lot of interests. That's the whole point of it, is that people feel they have a stake in it. It may well be that we do have competing coalitions. Again, the sort of the interesting rise of Israel, Greece, and Cyprus Gulf axis with Egypt. I think this is not necessarily predictable 10 years ago. Whether the Turkey-Qatar axis turns into something bigger, does it turn into an area of confrontation? I was talking with a Russian friend yesterday, whose view is that Russia's interest is in instability in the Eastern Mediterranean that keeps from developing the energy there, because that would be an alternative to Russian energy into Europe. So it's not that Russia wants to dominate, it's not that Russia wants Turkey to win, but Russia wants Turkey to fight against Israel and some of these other countries. And again, I think in some ways that's my view of Russian policies. It's not about making something, it's about preventing things and using small tools to prevent things from happening. I think it's possible. I think in that world, you're better off with the United States to diffuse things. You're better off with the United States to diminish tensions, to try to find workarounds. Unmanaged, it can be very messy on the edges. And with all these proxy wars we've already seen. But again, I don't see anybody coming in to play that role except the United States. I don't think China can play that role. Russia certainly can't play that role. I don't think Europe can play that role. You can have unregulated competition, but that's not good. And then the question is, comes down to this question of, will the United States want to devote energy and effort to it? My instinct is yes, because I think there's going to be somewhat more focus on Europe, certainly better relations with Europe based on Vice President, assuming there's a Biden administration, given Vice President Biden's long engagement with Europe. But it's not a sure thing.
Thank you, Professor. We already have, we are well past our time on our, but we have a couple of questions. If you can spare some more time.
Happy to spend more time.
Thanks a lot. There was one specific question about Iraq, and Mr. Prabhat, who is an intern at IDSA, he wanted to ask, but unfortunately his audio is not working, so I'll read out the question. He says, the last month the US announced troops cut back in Iraq. In light of the PMU crisis in Iraq, the Popular Mobilization Forces, does the US withdrawal would mean increased Iranian influence, or is there a chance that Iraq might regain its control under the new prime minister?
I think the new prime minister has his work cut out for him, partly keeping the US engaged, keeping the US and Iran from having proxy wars in Iraq. I think the prime minister of Iraq has a whole set of problems in Iraq related to the plunge in oil prices. And Iraq is a hard place. I think people wish the prime minister well. He certainly represented an acceptable compromise to both the Americans and the Iranians. But the rise of the popular mobilization forces, popular mobilization units, the Hashd al-Sha'bi, is an enduring challenge to the state, not only because some are agents of Iranian interest, but also because a lot of them are organized crime syndicates, which will challenge the central government's authority and will create an environment that will invite the rise of Sunni militia, which will battle against Shia militia, and it'll be back to where we were with the Islamic State or something like it. The long-term answer to Iraq is not a enduring U.S. military presence. The long-term answer has to be Iraqi capability. I think they've done some excellent work in that regard. And I think the Iraqis have been reconciling themselves to the fact there will be a different U.S. role. I'm not sure people understand what the U.S. role is going to be. I'm not sure I understand what the U.S. role is going to be, but the trend line is clear, which is the U.S. is going to be less and less engaged in Iraq over the long term. Not to plug my podcast again, but just yesterday, we released a episode of our Babel podcast with Hassan, who talked about an article he just wrote in New Lines magazine about Hisham al-Hashimi, who was researching Shia militia and was killed by Shia militia for the work he was doing. It's a very interesting conversation, and some of you may be interested. So you can find an Apple podcast wherever you get your podcasts. It's called Babel, Translating the Middle East. And Hassan is very, very interesting and knows more about Al-Qaeda and the way those kinds of organizations work than anybody else. And there are obvious parallels to how some of these Shia militia are operating in the country.
True, Professor. There's another question regarding how if a Biden administration comes, how would that affect the U.S. relations, specifically with Saudi Arabia? I mean, because on a number of occasions, candidate as a presidential candidate, Biden has said things which kind of implicates Saudi Arabia or Saudi crown prince in the killing of Jamal Khashoggi and the problems, the continuing problems in Yemen. So how do you think will that affect under Biden administration if that is the eventuality after elections?
Well, I do think that there's going to be a debate, a discussion between different priorities inside a Biden administration. But the other part is the Saudis get a vote too. I mean, the Saudis have to decide how they're going to engage with the Biden administration. The Saudis have to decide what they want the U.S. relationship to be. There is certainly a perception that President Trump and Jared Kushner have personalized this to a tremendous extent. I just read this new book, Blood and Oil, which is a very interesting book that came out in early September about Mohammed bin Salman, that argues that there was a very personal tie between Mohammed bin Salman and the White House. That's not going to be there in a Biden administration. So how would the Saudis respond to that environment? There certainly will be a change. You're not going to have a warm personal relationship, at least initially. I think there is deep discomfort with the Yemen war in large parts of the Democratic Party. I think for people who are Middle East experts like myself in Washington, a lot of us knew and talked to Jamal Khashoggi. And not only did we know and talk to him, but we appreciated that Jamal died thinking he was a Saudi patriot. And to have people murdered and dismembered by a government to whom they consider themselves loyal is disturbing. And I think that going to hang over this relationship. I will tell you, I told very senior Saudis in the royal family that the U.S.-Saudi relationship is important, and it will be hard for that relationship to move forward if the Crown Prince is the principal driver of the relationship. It just will be very hard. I still think that's true. I think in the Biden administration, the U.S.-Saudi relationship will be an important relationship. It will be very hard if the Crown Prince is the face of it.
Thank you. I think everyone would agree that we really had a great discussion. You made some very, very interesting points, and everyone will take away something very interesting from this discussion. For me personally, the point that that I take away in a nutshell is that US is not going anywhere from the Middle East, and perhaps it is also even though it will be there are opportunities for the like-minded countries to have greater engagement with the Middle East. And I think sitting in New Delhi, I'll also say that for India also there is an opportunity here. With that, I'll now request Sir to take over and say the final words.